The rain had not fallen in weeks, but the soil still looked wet, dark as if it remembered blood. Celia pressed her palms into it anyway, kneeling in her garden as dawn crept up from the river. She always began her days here, among the rows of greens and herbs. It was the only patch of earth she could call her own, though even that claim was only half true. Everything on Willowbrook belonged to Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford, even her breath, if one believed the way he spoke. But this morning, the air was different. It trembled with news. A boy had run from the big house with the kind of urgency that made people stop talking mid-word. He whispered first to the butler, then to the stable hands, and finally, inevitably, the rumor reached Celia in the garden. The colonel would make a spectacle of her son, Marcus, at tomorrow's jubilee. The host slid from her hands. She didn't cry out, not even when the boy's name left the messenger's lips. She simply looked down at the soil clinging to her fingertips, the way it filled the lines of her skin, black and unyielding. Inside, her heart slammed against her ribs. Outside, she stood up slowly, wiping her palms on her apron, face still as carved wood. No one could see her break. Not here. Not now. The camera would linger on her face, strong, unflinching, but her eyes carrying the weight of storms unshed. Celia walked toward the house, where the smell of roasting pork drifted through the air. Preparations for tomorrow's feast had already begun. Her steps were measured. She could not falter. In this place, faltering meant someone else's hand closing around her child's neck. Willowbrook was dressed like a palace. White columns lined the veranda, catching the first rays of light, their polish hiding the rot beneath. At night, lanterns glowed so bright they seemed to ward off darkness itself. But Celia knew better. This house was built to trap the dark inside. She entered through the servant's door, into the kitchen where she spent most of her life. The hearth burned hot already. Pots clanged. Knives chopped rhythmically on wooden blocks. Other women worked in silence, each lost in her own burden, each knowing that tomorrow's feast would be larger, crueler, more dangerous than any before. Celia bent over the chopping board, taking up a knife. She cut onions until her eyes stung, until no one could tell the difference between tears from grief and tears from the blade. In the parlor, on the other side of a thin wall, the colonel rehearsed his speech. His voice carried into the kitchen like a sermon. 25 years of prosperity. 25 years of order. Tomorrow, we show the county why Willowbrook stands as a beacon. The words rolled out smooth, confident, rehearsed. He spoke of prosperity, of legacy, of discipline. Celia's hand stilled on the knife. She knew what that last word meant. It always meant flesh. She could see Marcus in her mind, 7 years old, too thin for his age, but bright-eyed, always humming scraps of old songs when he thought no one was listening. His laughter was rare but pure, a light she clung to. And tomorrow, they meant to snuff it out in front of men who would clap their hands and call it instruction. The knife bit into the board. She inhaled, sharp, steady. Night came, and the house glittered with preparations. Silver polished until it gleamed like ice. Goblets aligned in perfect rows. The ballroom reeked of wax and wine, though no one had yet touched a drop. From the balcony above the dining hall, Celia watched unseen as chandeliers flickered to life, spilling golden light across the long table. 17 chairs had been arranged for the guests of honor, each one upholstered in velvet, each one waiting for a man who believed himself untouchable. She counted them once, then again. 17. Celia gripped the railing until her knuckles blanched. Tomorrow, those chairs would be filled with men who laughed at children's cries, who called cruelty civilization. And tomorrow, they would eat what she placed before them. She returned to the quarters long after the others had gone to bed. Marcus was already asleep, curled small under a rough wool blanket, thumb pressed against his lip. She knelt beside him, brushed a curl from his forehead, and pressed her mouth to the crown of his head. For the first time that day, her eyes closed, and her body shook. Not with despair. Despair was useless. What coursed through her veins was something harder, steadier. Resolve. Tomorrow, the house would feast. Tomorrow, it would choke on its own hunger. And no one, not even the colonel himself, would see her coming. The day after the colonel's announcement, the plantation buzzed like a hive. Carpenters hammered new platforms, seamstresses stitched banners, and the blacksmith sharpened iron fittings for the pavilion where tomorrow's lesson would unfold. It was supposed to be a celebration, 25 years of Willowbrook prosperity, but the undercurrent was fear. Fear for those who would serve. Fear for those who would watch. Fear, most of all, for the boy whose name had been chosen. Celia moved through the kitchen with the calm of someone carrying a storm under her apron. She stirred broth, kneaded dough, arranged spices. To anyone watching, she looked no different than usual. That was her gift, invisibility. But behind her eyes, thoughts stacked like stones. She counted days the way some count prayers. 30 left. 29. Each one was a step she could not misplace. At dawn, she went to her garden. To the untrained eye, it was only a patch of earth beside the smokehouse. But to Celia, it was a ledger of memory. Basil from her mother's hands, bitter greens from the old woman who taught her which roots healed and which harmed. She brushed the leaves lightly, not plucking, not yet. Timing was everything. She whispered to herself as she worked, her voice low, a rhythm almost like humming. Marcus sometimes asked what she said out there. She always told him the truth, though in words a child could hold. I'm asking the garden to listen. Marcus followed her that morning, bare feet kicking dust, hair wild from sleep. He carried a stick as if it were a sword, swinging at shadows. Celia smiled faintly, but her chest ached. Stay close, she told him, though he already was. He leaned against her side as she crouched, watching her pull weeds. His head reached barely past her shoulder. She thought of how small he would look against a stage built for cruelty. The thought nearly split her in two, but she swallowed it whole. Evenings brought a different kind of silence. After the fields emptied and the overseer's boots no longer cracked through the quarters, whispers passed from mouth to mouth. Men and women bent over washboards or mending, voices lowered to a pitch meant for ears only inches away. Rumors grew legs. Perhaps the colonel wanted to invite senators. Perhaps the governor himself would come. Others said the demonstration was meant to be written about in northern papers. Proof of how discipline preserved order. Celia listened, but said little. Her stillness drew eyes. Some wondered if she would beg. Some feared she would break. But those who knew her best, the elder women who had shared fires with her since she was a girl, watched her in silence, as if they recognized a language on her face that no one else could read. One evening, old Mariah, who kept the laundry, stopped Celia in the yard. Her hands were raw from soap and lye, but her grip was strong. The boy, she whispered. Celia nodded once. Nothing more. Mariah's mouth tightened. She pressed something small into Celia's palm, a scrap of cloth tied with thread, smelling faintly of sage. Keep it on him, she said. Won't stop a lash, but might turn an eye long enough. Celia closed her fingers around it, the weight of solidarity heavier than stone. The days stacked. Preparations multiplied. Carriages came and went, deliveries of wine and meats and silks. In the kitchen, Celia stood over the hearth until her skin gleamed with sweat. She tasted sauces, adjusted spices, memorized every motion of her helpers, who looked away when she reached for the jar at the back of the shelf, who noticed nothing at all, who watched too closely. She filed it all away. At night, when the house was quiet, she practiced in her head. Timing. Placement. She didn't need recipes. She had something sharper, precision born of survival. On the 25th night, Marcus woke crying. He had dreamed of the pavilion, of lights so bright they burned, of men pointing at him as if he were an object, not a boy. Celia gathered him into her lap, rocking him back and forth, humming that low tune again. Mama, don't let them, he began, but she pressed her hand gently to his lips. They won't, she whispered. Not while I'm breathing. Her voice was steady, but inside her chest, her heart pounded like a war drum. She felt the truth of her promise harden into something unbreakable. By the time dawn lit the 30th day, the plantation looked like a stage set for a cruel pageant. Flags hung from the veranda. Musicians tuned their instruments. Servants polished silver until it reflected faces they did not want to see. Celia stood at the kitchen threshold, her apron tied, her face calm. In her pocket, she carried the cloth charm Mariah had given her. In her eyes, fire burned, not of rage alone, but of calculation. The feast was no longer just an event. It was a battlefield, and she had already chosen her weapon. The Jubilee morning arrived bright, hot, and merciless. The sun glared down on Willowbrook as if it, too, wanted to witness what the house had planned. Servants moved like clockwork, scrubbing floors, arranging bouquets, and setting the long dining table with china so fine it could blind a man if the light caught right. The air smelled of wax, roasted meat, and polish. Everything shimmered with celebration, except the people forced to make it happen. Celia kept to the kitchen, her sleeves rolled, her hands steady. From the moment she woke, she had known this was the day her plan would either live or die with her. But as she bent over the hearth, stirring, basting, directing, another thought pressed against her ribs. Marcus. Where was he? She had left him in the quarters under Mariah's care, but rumors traveled fast on days like this. Someone had seen an overseer near the children's huts. Another whispered the boy had been moved closer to the pavilion. The words sliced through her composure like knives. Her ladle clanged against the pot. One of the younger girls looked at her nervously. Celia straightened, face smoothed, voice calm. "More salt," she said, handing the girl a jar. Inside, though, her thoughts roared. They're moving too soon. By mid-afternoon, carriages began rolling down the drive, wheels crunching over gravel. The first guests arrived in stiff suits and brighter dresses, their laughter carrying ahead of them like banners. Celia glimpsed them through the kitchen window, men with chests puffed, women with fans fluttering, boys practicing arrogance like an inheritance. Each face a mask of confidence, none of them imagining the ground shifting under their feet. The colonel greeted them on the steps, shaking hands, making promises, boasting of the night's lesson. His voice carried into every corner. "Gentlemen, tonight will not be forgotten. Willowbrook stands as proof that order, once established, can endure forever." Forever. The word curdled in Celia's stomach. She tightened her grip on the serving tray until her knuckles whitened. The turning point came just before dusk. She was arranging goblets when the kitchen door burst open and Marcus stumbled in, dragged by an overseer with a grip like iron. The boy's cheeks were wet, his breath hitched in little gasps. Celia froze. For a moment, everything inside her stopped. The fire, the noise, even the air itself. Then it all came rushing back like a flood. The overseer sneered. "Colonel says the boy waits here. Easier to fetch when it's time." He shoved Marcus onto a stool in the corner, then left without another word. Celia's hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the tray. She set it down hard on the counter, steadied herself, and turned. Marcus looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. She wanted to run to him, hold him, swear that nothing would happen, but she couldn't risk being watched. There were always eyes. Instead, she crossed the kitchen slowly, knelt, and cupped his face with flour-dusted palms. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "Stay small. I'll take care of the rest." Marcus nodded, though a tear slipped down his cheek. She wiped it with her thumb, then rose, pulling her apron tighter. Something inside her, a thin, fragile thread of hesitation, snapped clean. Night fell. Lanterns lit the verandas, chandeliers blazed above the dining room, and music drifted from the hired band. Guests filled their chairs, 17 velvet thrones for 17 self-proclaimed kings. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, pride thickened the air until it was almost a fog. Celia moved among them like a shadow dressed in linen. She poured wine, served meat, offered bread. Her eyes never lingered too long on any one man, but her mind catalogued everything. Who ate quickly, who hesitated, who reached greedily for seconds. But her pulse beat faster than before, because Marcus was only one room away. She could feel his presence like a candle flickering behind a wall, fragile, vulnerable, too close to discovery. One wrong glance, one careless noise, one curious guest wandering too far, and all would unravel. Then came the surprise. As the colonel rose to give his speech, chest out, glass raised, Marcus slipped from the kitchen doorway. He was small, but the room was brighter than day, and 17 heads turned as one. The child froze. The colonel smiled. "Ah," he boomed. "Our little lesson, come to greet his tutors." Laughter rippled across the table. Celia's blood turned to fire. She stepped forward instinctively, tray in hand, intercepting, masking. Her body blocked Marcus from view. Her voice calm though her heart thundered. "Pardon, sir," the boy strayed. "I'll return him to his place." The colonel's smile sharpened. but he waved dismissively. See that he's ready. He'll have his moment. Celia bowed slightly, turned, and her hand closed firmly around Marcus's shoulder. She guided him back through the kitchen doors, her movements smooth, her face unreadable. Only when the door shut behind them did her mask crack. She knelt, gripping him by both shoulders. You listen to me, she whispered, fierce as a prayer. Not a sound, not a step. You stay hidden, Marcus. Tonight is not their night. Tonight belongs to us. Her son nodded, trembling, but this time there was no confusion in his eyes. Only trust. Celia rose, straightened her back, and stepped out again into the blaze of chandeliers. Her decision was no longer quiet. It was thunder. Tonight, she would not only save her son. Tonight, she would end the feast. The dining room glowed like a furnace, chandeliers spilling gold onto linen so white it hurt the eyes. 17 guests leaned back in velvet chairs, their laughter louder now, their cups refilled again and again. The room carried the smell of roasted meats, sugared fruits, and something deeper, anticipation, sharpened like a blade. Celia moved through it all with a tray balanced on her palms. Each step measured, each glance calculated. Inside, though, her body was taut as a bowstring. Marcus was hidden in the scullery, just a thin wall away. Every giggle from a drunk guest, every scrape of a chair, every footman passing too close to that door made her skin prickle. One slip, and the boy would be dragged back into the fire. She bent to refill the senator's goblet. His hand brushed her wrist deliberately, lingering. Steady hands, girl, he drawled. Don't waste good wine. His teeth gleamed red from the drink. Celia did not flinch. Yes, sir, she said softly, her voice so even it disguised the scream clawing at her throat. At the head of the table, Colonel Rutherford rose again, rapping a silver spoon against his glass. The sound cut through chatter until silence spread like spilled ink. His eyes swept the room, resting on each man as though bestowing a blessing. Gentlemen and ladies, he began, Willowbrook's 25 years stand as proof of what order can achieve. Tonight, we honor that order with a demonstration so clear, even the youngest among us will remember it all his days. Celia's throat tightened. The youngest among us. Her son. The guests applauded, polite and eager. Some leaned forward as though the cruelty promised was a dessert in itself. Celia's hands clenched around the tray. For one wild heartbeat, she imagined hurling it across the table, glass and wine shattering in defiance. But no, she needed silence, patience, timing. Fury would only get Marcus killed. She slipped back into the kitchen. Marcus crouched low behind sacks of flour, his knees drawn to his chest. His eyes darted up at her, wide and waiting. They won't have you, she whispered, kneeling beside him. Her fingers brushed the charm Mariah had given him, still tied at his neck. No matter what noise you hear, you stay here. Understand? He nodded, but his lip trembled. Mama, I'm scared. Celia pulled him into her arms, pressing his face against her shoulder. For a moment, the weight of him nearly undid her. He was so small, yet he carried all her strength inside him. She held him tighter, as if her embrace could build walls no overseer could breach. You let me carry the fear, she said into his hair. You just breathe. When she pulled back, her hands lingered on his cheeks. Her eyes burned, but she forced them clear. If he saw her break, the whole plan would break with her. She kissed his forehead, then rose, straightening her apron as though it were armor. Back in the hall, the guests had grown louder. The judge recited a crude joke that drew roaring laughter. A planter boasted about whipping 3 men with a single hand tied. The sound of it churned Celia's stomach, but she smiled faintly as she poured, invisible as air. She caught sight of Rutherford watching her. His gaze was sharp, suspicious. He prided himself on knowing every move in his house, every breath in his kitchen. Celia felt the weight of it, a hand pressing down on her neck. He lifted his goblet slowly, eyes never leaving hers. To discipline, he said, voice booming. To discipline, the guests echoed, crystal clinking. Celia bowed her head, hiding the blaze in her eyes. Yes, she thought, drink. Let discipline be the chain that pulls you under. The air thickened as the meal stretched on. Sweat beaded on foreheads, though the night was cool. Celia watched the first signs flicker, a man dabbing his lips too often, a woman shifting uneasily in her chair. A tremor in a hand. a swallow that caught halfway down the throat. Her chest tightened. It was working. The feast itself was turning against them. But with every passing moment, the danger to Marcus grew. If anyone suspected, they would scour the house, tear through every room. The boy could not be found. Not tonight. Celia steadied her breathing, set down the empty tray, and pressed her palms flat against the table's edge. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished silver, calm, composed, unreadable. Inside, though, the storm raged. The table was ready. The moment was near. And Celia knew, once she crossed the threshold of action, there would be no return. At first it was only a flicker, small enough to be mistaken for clumsiness. A planter at the far end of the table dropped his fork, muttered a laugh, and reached for it with fingers that seemed slower than they should have been. The woman beside him dabbed her lips, then her forehead, then her lips again, as though heat and shame had conspired to choke her. Celia, standing near the door with her tray, felt her breath stall. This was the hinge. The moment when possibility became consequence. The colonel raised his glass, oblivious. Another toast. His voice boomed, drunk on his own order. To the land that feeds us, and the hands that shape it. The hands. Celia almost laughed. Almost, because those very hands had shaped tonight into his undoing. The goblets lifted. Crystal rang like brittle bells. Then the tremors began. The senator's voice faltered mid-sentence, his words slipping like coins through cracked fingers. His jaw slackened, wine staining his shirt front as his hand spasmed. Across from him, the judge clutched the table edge, knuckles bone white, his eyes wide with a recognition he would never admit aloud, fear. Chairs scraped violently against the floor. A widow gasped, fanning herself with desperate speed until the fan broke clean in half. A boy no older than 20 staggered to his feet, tried to speak, then bent double, retching onto the velvet rug. The room, once thick with laughter, now pulsed with chaos. Celia did not move. She stood still as stone, watching. The colonel slammed his fist on the table. "What is this?" His voice cracked, the command fraying. He looked around, his certainty peeling away with every body that faltered. Wine gone sour? Some sickness carried in. But when his own breath hitched, his eyes shot to Celia. Her face was calm, too calm, and in that instant, he understood. "You." His voice broke into a cough, a wet, hacking sound that splattered the linen with red. He tried to rise, but his legs betrayed him, buckling beneath the weight of a man who had never imagined his own fall. The sight of him collapsing sent a ripple through the room. Panic finally unmasked itself. Guests clawed at their throats, clawed at one another, tried to stumble toward doors that suddenly seemed too far away. Silver clattered to the floor. Goblets overturned, wine mingling with spittle and bile until the table ran sticky and dark. The chandeliers above swung as bodies thrashed beneath them, the music outside stuttering to silence. Celia stepped forward at last, not with violence, not with triumph, but with a quiet, steady grace. She lifted a fallen goblet, set it upright, wiped the rim with her apron. Around her, men convulsed, women collapsed, voices cracked into prayers or curses. She leaned down beside the judge, who lay gasping, and pressed his hand flat against his chest, as if to soothe him. "This is what order tastes like," she murmured. He could not answer. His eyes rolled back, glassy. One by one, the voices thinned. The clamor dulled to groans, then whispers, then nothing but the rasp of dying breath. Through it all, Celia moved like a midwife in reverse, ushering not life into the world, but endings. Straightening limbs, closing eyes, folding hands that had once struck like whips, now soft and powerless. At the head of the table, Colonel Rutherford still fought. He clawed at the cloth, dragging it half off the table in his thrashing. Silverware rained to the floor in a cacophony. His eyes locked on Celia's, hatred burning through the fog of his failing body. "You think this wins," he spat, voice raw, lips flecked with foam. "You think they won't come for you?" Celia did not answer. She simply held his gaze, calm, unshaken, until his chest seized and the hatred drained from his face. When he fell still, she reached across the table, took his goblet, and set it carefully beside his hand. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the house had ever known. Heavy, complete, final. Celia stood at the center of it, breathing slow, her body steady though her knees longed to give way. The table looked almost peaceful now, a banquet of fallen power, 17 bodies draped like discarded costumes. She turned and slipped back through the kitchen doors. Marcus still crouched behind the flour sacks, eyes wide, clutching the charm at his neck. "It's done," she whispered, pulling him into her arms. Her voice shook now at last. "It's done." He buried his face against her chest, his small body trembling. She held him, rocking slightly, her hands clutching him tighter than she ever had before. Through the walls, the chandeliers still swayed, and the house seemed to breathe out a long, exhausted sigh. For the first time in its long, cruel history, Willowbrook belonged to silence. By dawn, the house was no longer a mansion but a mausoleum. The chandeliers still glimmered faintly, their crystals catching the weak morning light. The table, once so proud, sagged under the weight of its stillness. 17 guests lay as if painted into a final portrait, mouths slack, hands folded where Celia had left them. The servants who discovered the scene did not scream. Screaming would have been a luxury, a sound for people safe enough to let go. Instead, their voices lowered to a murmur, a kind of hymn made of disbelief. Word spread, quick as fire on dry grass. By noon, riders thundered down the county roads, carrying tales of the Willowbrook feast that had turned to ash. Celia did not run. She did not beg. She stood in the kitchen with Marcus clutched against her hip, waiting. When the sheriff came with men in dark coats, she met them at the door. Her wrists were bound, but her spine remained unbent. The trial was swift, but it was not quiet. The courtroom swelled with people desperate to see her face, some to condemn, some to glimpse a woman who had struck the unstrikable. The judge read charges with a voice thick as tar. Witnesses whispered about poisons, about hidden calculations, about vengeance. And yet, when Celia spoke, her words carried clearer than theirs. "They would have killed my son," she said, her voice even. "They called it order. They called it instruction. I called it enough." The room shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, as though shame had crept in through the cracks. Others hardened, afraid of what such truth might mean if it traveled too far. The verdict was no surprise. Guilty. Sentence: death by hanging. The date chosen swift and merciless. On the morning of her execution, the sky was unremarkable, pale, almost indifferent. Crowds gathered, as crowds always do when spectacle is promised. Celia walked the steps without faltering. In the hush before the noose was fixed, she lifted her face to the onlookers. Her voice did not shake. "You can end my breath," she said, "but not the hunger for freedom. That's already in the soil, and the soil feeds everything." The rope tightened, the trap released, and for one terrible, endless moment, all of Willowbrook seemed to hold its breath. But stories are not buried so easily. In the weeks that followed, letters surfaced from places no sheriff could search, tucked into hymnals, stitched into quilts, hidden in the seams of baskets. They spoke of Celia, not as murderer, but as mother, as shield, as spark. Her act was whispered across kitchens and fields, told in the hush of night where ears bent close. The masters tightened their grip in fear. Food was tasted, locks were doubled, suspicion thickened. But fear cannot erase memory. And memory, once seated, grows. Marcus lived. That fact alone became its own kind of defiance. He grew into a man who never mistook silence for safety. Years later, when he told his children of that night, he did not describe the sickness, or the chaos, or even the bodies at the table. He told them of his mother's eyes, steady, fierce, unbroken. And in that telling, Celia did not die. She sat forever at the edge of the table, folding hands, setting goblets, waiting for the moment when truth would finally sit down and eat. Eat too.